Hey guys, tonight we're heading far away from blinking screens and humming appliances. We're walking barefoot through warm golden sand under the Egyptian sun. Okay. Yes, it's still nighttime where you are, but the sun's blazing down in our story. Just go with it. You're standing in a quiet temple courtyard, the kind that hums with old silence. The stone under your feet is warm, everything around you is older than most countries, and even the shadows feel dignified. You're not here for pyramids tonight, or mummies, or pharaoh drama. Not even crocodile dung eyeliner though, let's not rule that out completely. No, tonight, we're starting somewhere a little stranger, smaller. Stranger because it's the kind of detail most tourists wouldn't even notice. You're standing in front of a statue life-size, roughly chiseled, worn down by sand and time. It's a seated figure. The face is missing, so is most of the torso, but the feet, still there. And on those feet, carved right into the stone toes, are ears. Not big cartoon ears, just faint, almond-shaped carving sewn on each foot. Like the statue, long since silenced, is still listening, but not with its head, with the soles of its feet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you drifting off from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel to get a closer look. These aren't modern vandalism. They're intentional, balanced, symmetrical. They've been here a while. You glance around to see if anyone else notices and realize no one's even looking. You're the only one who thinks this statue's feet might be eavesdropping. Mainstream historical fact. In ancient Egypt, certain statues, especially those placed near temples or shrines, were carved with ears. It wasn't random. These were known as listening statues or hearing ears. The idea was simple and surprisingly democratic. People could whisper prayers, complaints, or wishes to these statues, and the ears would hear, then passing them on to gods, spirits, or the right set of ears in power. It's a bit like mailing a letter to the divine. No stamps, just a carved ear and a hopeful whisper. And yes, most ears were placed on the head or shoulders of the statue, but not always. Here comes the quirky tidbit. There are documented examples, rare, but real of statues with ears carved on their feet. Archaeologists have found them near thresholds, doorways, temple courtyards. Not decorative, not symmetrical flourish. Actual ears, on toes, on ankles, sometimes in pairs, sometimes more than two. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or functional. Were they meant to listen for people entering sacred spaces? Did the feet touch the earth to hear secrets whispered into the sand? Or maybe they were meant to be listened to, not the other way around. A kind of divine two-way radio, carved in stone. You run your fingers over one of the ears. It's shallow but smooth. Whoever carved this wasn't rushing. There's care in it. And you realize something else. The statue isn't raised on a pedestal. It's at ground level. Eye level with ankles, right where someone kneeling might look during a prayer or a confession. You sit down beside it, quietly. The air's warm, but still. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, a bird cries once, then falls silent. You close your eyes, just for a second, and imagine being one of those long-ago worshippers, someone with a worry, a hope. A secret you couldn't say out loud to a priest, but maybe you could say it to a stone. It's oddly comforting, the idea that someone, somewhere, figured out how to make a statue that could listen. Not speak, not scold, just listen. You're not just standing in front of history anymore, you're part of it. And the ears? They're still there, waiting, listening. You step out from the shaded path and into a courtyard made of stone, where the heat seems to shimmer up from the ground itself. You can smell the age of it dust, sun baked into silence, and something else too, something older, maybe incense, maybe limestone, maybe just time itself settling into the cracks. The walls around you aren't smooth. They ripple and shift slightly, not in motion but in present sorrows of columns, each one carved with care, surround this space like silent, patient guardians. And above them, in neat lines or bursts of expression, are the stories. The reliefs stretch for meters in every direction, gods receiving offerings, pharaohs smiting enemies, falcons with eyes too wide to blink. You've seen Egyptian walls before, maybe in a museum, maybe in a movie, but this is different. This is the kind of space where sound feels curated. You whisper, and it doesn't bounce. It tucks itself into a corner and waits. You walk slowly across the courtyard floor, your sandal scuffing softly. Your gaze is pulled to the base of one of the statues near the temple entrance. It's taller than life, of course, and carved from a dark stone that absorbs the sunlight rather than reflects it. And at first, it looks like any other statue. Broad shoulders, arms straight, 1 foot forward, the usual pharaonic stance of quiet authority. But then you look down, past the robe, past the carefully modeled sandals, down to the feet. There, nestled near the ankles, ears. Actual ears, human-like, carved with all the curves and ridges you'd expect if someone bent down and pressed their head to the ground. You crouch to look closer. They're not huge or not cartoonishly exaggerated, but unmistakable. Mainstream fact. This wasn't a one-time artistic quirk. Dozens of temple statues across ancient Egypt feature ears in strange places. On feet, yes, but also on walls. Sometimes one ear, sometimes several. Archaeologists call them listening ears, and they pop up especially in temples and sanctuaries built during the New Kingdom and late period. You reach out, without really thinking, and hover your hand near the foot, not to touch, just to feel. The stone is warm from the sun, but the carved ear feels different somehow. Not colder, not warmer, just more awake. Here's where it gets interesting. Some believe these ears weren't just decorative. They weren't about making the gods look quirky. They were messages, or, more precisely, mechanisms. Ways for the divine to hear you. Quirky tidbit. In some temple courtyards, especially those dedicated to healing gods like Thoth or Isis worshippers, would approach these listening ears and whisper their prayers directly into them. Like voicemail for the divine. A wish, a plea, a complaint, a confessional murmured into a foot-shaped hotline. And then you left. No receipt, no confirmation. Just the faith that someone, or something, was listening. You glance around the courtyard again. It's easy to imagine. A young woman in a linen dress, clutching a small basket of figs. A laborer with dust in his hair and a tightness in his shoulders. An elderly priest, walking slowly, leaning forward to speak into stone. Each of them trusting that their words, however fragile, would reach the right ears. The design made practical sense, too. Ears carved low on statues meant the petitioner didn't have to climb or shout. The gods didn't demand spectacle, just sincerity. Just a whisper would do. Historians still argue whether these ears were primarily symbolic, just reminders that the gods were always listening, or whether they were believed to actually hear. Some texts refer to them as ears of hearing, implying a kind of sacred surveillance. Others frame them as emotional outlet safe spaces, where the weight of your daily struggle could be transferred to something bigger than yourself. You start to walk the perimeter of the courtyard now, eyes scanning the walls. More ears, some pairs, some in clusters. One wall has a whole row like a divine eavesdropping gallery. They're carved directly into the limestone, just above eye level. You wonder how many voices they've heard, how many secrets they hold. A breeze sweeps through the courtyard suddenly, pulling your robe tight against your legs. It carries with it a faint scent of lotus and dust. You stop beside a small offering tabulate surface, worn smooth by centuries of hands. A bowl sits there, empty now, but once it might have held milk, beer, or a bit of honey cake, something for the gods. A trade, maybe. Here's this small sweetness. Now, please listen. You lower yourself onto the edge of the low wall and rest your hands in your lap. The ears are all around you now, and for a moment, the silence becomes something else. Not absence, but attention. You're not alone in here. Not really. You imagine someone, thousands of years ago, kneeling right where you are, their voice shaking, or steady. Maybe they were asking for a child, or relief from pain, or just to be seen, just to be acknowledged. It's easy to scoff now, with modern ears. Stone can't listen, you might say. But if you've ever whispered a name into a wind and felt better, you already know better. If you've ever talked to a gravestone, or left a note on a sticky wall in a temple or a train station, you've already done it. Reached out to something that can't respond and asked it to hold your words anyway. The Egyptians just made that impulse literal, gave it shape, gave it granite and intention. You press your palms together now, not in prayer, exactly, but in presence. The air is thicker here, but not heavy, more like it's carrying something. You close your eyes, just for a moment, and listen. The wind moves. The stone breathes. And somewhere, in the whirls of an ancient foot, a story curls tighter around itself. The temple's inner passages draw you forward now, not as a tourist might follow a rope or a sign, but the way a thread moves through fabric, with purpose, but without rush. You step past the last line of sunlight, and the light shifts around you, softening into gold. The walls close in gently. These aren't the vast, sunlit courtyards anymore. These are whispering halls. Places that catch your breath before you speak and tuck it into cracks between carved hieroglyphs. Here, the gods are closer. You move slowly, your footsteps muffled by stone worn smooth from centuries of sandals. There's a coolness to the air, the kind that has nothing to do with weather, the kind that clings to memory. The passage you're in is narrow, no wider than your outstretched arms, and the walls rise above you in carved reliefs so intricate they almost shimmer. Every inch tells a story of offerings given, battles fought, stars charted, but it's what's near the floor that stops you. Another ear. Not part of a statue this time. This one is carved directly into the base of the wall. It's small, simple, and surprisingly delicate-tucked, just beside a faded offering inscription. You kneel to look more closely. The grooves of the carving are worn smooth, like it's been touched 1,000 times. Maybe it has. Mainstream fact. These wall-carved ears became especially common during Egypt's New Kingdom and late period, often appearing in temple niches or along processional routes. Scholars call them oracular ears, and they were often located in spaces associated with divine judgments where answers might be sought from the gods through rituals or dreams. You place your hand beside the ear, not touching it, just acknowledging it, and you can almost hear it not with your ears, but with something quieter. These weren't passive decorations. These were invitations. Some researchers believe worshippers used these ears as points of contact during oracles' rituals, in which they asked the gods for guidance and waited for signs in dreams, omens, or even the behavior of birds. The ears weren't listening on their own. They were conduits, like those little paper slots at fortune-telling booths. Slip in a question, wait for a whisper. Quirky tidbit. In some temple precincts, it was customary to whisper a wish into the ear and then press your forehead to the wall, sealing the request. If the god answered, say, if the Nile flooded well that year, or your goats birthed healthy kids, you were expected to come back and carve a thank you inscription. Some temple walls are littered with these ancient reviews, carved Yelp stars for divine service. One inscription, roughly translated, reads, "The god listened, my son was healed." You rise again, walking deeper into the passage. The light dims, but your eyes adjust. More ears, some placed low, like those meant for children or the sick. Others clustered near junctions places, where decisions must have felt especially urgent. There's something striking in that placement. These weren't grand ears high above your head. They were reachable, accessible. The gods of this temple didn't want worshippers to grovel. They wanted connection. At eye level, foot level, soul level. Historians still argue whether this proliferation of listening ears was a shift in theology or just an architectural fad. Did the Egyptians of this period believe the gods were growing more attentive? Or did people simply crave a more personal line to the divine as life became more uncertain? Whatever the answer, the result was a network of carved presence, an entire city of stone listeners. You enter a side chamber now, smaller, domed, and filled with the residue of breath and offering. The altar at the center has long been cleared, but in its place is something better. Light. A single beam cutting through a slit in the ceiling, angled just right to strike the floor in front of yet another pair of ears. This time, they flank the threshold, like guards, or like hands cupped gently to the wind. You sit on the cool floor, legs folded beneath you, and just breathe. There's something beautiful in this idea, isn't there? That even in a society filled with formality, hierarchy, ritual, someone thought to say, let's make sure the gods can hear us. Let's give them ears not just in heaven, but on earth. And not high up, not unreachable, but low, close, human. It's hard not to see the kindness in that, not just awe. And then you smile. Because maybe that's what these ears really are. Not just for listening, but for noticing. Not just divine surveillance, but sacred empathy. Like the universe whispering back, I'm here, go ahead, I'm listening. You lean forward now, placing your hands on your knees. The wall in front of you is blank, save for a single, deep-set ear. You take a slow breath and say something small into the quiet. Not because you expect an answer, but because someone, once, carved this space so that you could. You rise slowly from the chamber, your knees brushing the cool stone as you push upright. The silence stays with you, not empty, not hollow, but full in its own way. Like the pause after someone says something important and you're still holding your breath, letting it land. The air has changed, just slightly, as if something old has shifted inside the temple walls, and now it's your turn to keep walking. You step into a longer corridor, dimly lit by narrow slots carved high into the walls, just enough for stray shafts of dusty sunlight to pierce the dark. The scent here is different too. Stone, heat, something faintly sweet, maybe old offerings, maybe the memory of incense. You pass more ears, dozens of them. Some barely more than scratches, others large enough to cup with both hands. You start to notice variations. Some are stylized, almost decorative. Others are so naturalistic they look like they might twitch. You pause at one particularly elaborate pair. They're framed by lines of inscription, flanked by two small images of the goddess Hathor. You reach out, stopping just short of touching them. A part of you wonders how many hands have hovered here before yours. How many stories were whispered into these groove splees for protection, dreams of children, confessions, bargaining, gratitude. Mainstream fact: by the late New Kingdom, certain temples had designated listening chapels, spaces filled with ears carved into the walls and statues alike. These rooms functioned almost like divine post offices. Worshippers would come with written petitions, sometimes beautifully inscribed on papyrus, sometimes just scratched on potsherd sand, place them in baskets near the ears, believing the gods would receive and consider them. You step into one of these rooms now. You can tell it's a listening chapel, not by a sign, but by a feeling, a certain weight to the space. The floor is worn more deeply here, the stone smoother. This is a place where knees have rested, where foreheads have bowed. The walls are covered with urshundreds, small ones, large ones, some nested together like families. It's not overwhelming. It's intimate, like walking into a room filled with old friends who've been waiting for you. On a ledge, you find a broken bit of pottery and ostrakhan, just a shard, half covered in faded ink. You can't read it, not fully, but there's a name, a date, and something about a harvest. It doesn't matter what it says exactly. What matters is that someone once sat here, years ago, and scribbled out a message to the gods, maybe while the sun rose, maybe while they were crying. You imagine their hand trembling, their breath uneven, and still, they wrote. Quirky tidbit: some temples even had officials whose job it was to read these petitions aloud. If the worshipper couldn't write, or didn't know how to address a god properly, they could ask the lector priest to read their message into the ear of the statue, like a translator for divine bureaucracy. You glance around, no priest now, no petition basket, but the ears remain, always listening. And this is where it gets strange. Because suddenly, you notice something. The ears are clustered around the feet of a nearby statue, not on its head, not on its chest, its feet. You walk over slowly, circling the figure. It's tall, slightly weathered, standing in the classic pose, left leg forward, arms at its sides, eyes gazing toward eternity. But down at its base, carved directly into the stone platform, are two perfectly formed ears, one on each side. Mainstream interpretation has long called this symbolic, the idea being, if you approached from the front, your voice would drift downward toward the feet, and the ears, carved there, would hear your prayer. But as you crouch down to examine them, another thought arises. What if these weren't symbolic at all? What if people believed the gods could listen through the very earth they stood on, through the souls of their statues? What if they thought voices rose through stone like heat drawn upward through reverence? Historians still argue whether these feet ears were practical, symbolic, or part of a much older tradition. Some link them to African and Mesopotamian concepts of divine presenceware. The feet of sacred objects weren't just supports, but portals. Others suggest it was about humility, that worshippers should speak not to a god's face, but to the lowest, most grounded part, not out of shame, but out of respect. You run your fingers along the base of the statue, tracing the groove around one carved ear. It's smooth, polished by centuries of touches, of voices, of hope, and maybe something else too. Because here's the fringe theory that's barely whispered in the academic halls, but passed like rumor among tour guides and temple guards. Some believe the ears weren't just for gods to hear you, they were for you to hear the gods. A two-way conduit. Not just asking, but receiving. Not just prayers, but answers. There are stories, quiet ones, of people who pressed their ears to the base of statues and heard things. Words, songs, warnings. Maybe it was wind, maybe echo, maybe imagination, but maybe not. You close your eyes for a moment, pressing your palm to the platform beside the ear. Nothing. And yet, you rise slowly, feeling a little ridiculous, but also not really, because even the act of listening is an offering. Even silence can be sacred. You glance around the room once more. The ears on the walls seem to shimmer faintly in the half-light, not because they move, but because now you're paying attention. You begin to walk again, stepping out into another corridor where sunlight slices down through a narrow cut in the roof. The light lands on another statue Bassano ears this time, just a faded inscription. But nearby, etched into the floor, is a single ear, worn, faint, but still present. You smile. They're everywhere. And maybe that was the point. That listening isn't confined to statues, or temples, or gods. Maybe listening, real listening, is what keeps memory alive, what turns stone into story, silence into presence. You reach the far end of the hall, where an arch leads outside. The wind has picked up again. The scent of sand and sun returns, familiar now. You pause at the threshold, one hand resting on the carved frame. Beside your fingers, almost hidden in the shadow, is one final ear. You lean close, and for a moment, just one, you swear you hear breath. Not yours, not the wind. Something older, something waiting. You move slowly now, past the columns and into a narrower hallway that breathes dust and incense. The light dims again, but this time it doesn't feel heavy. It feels like you're being let into something, a secret, a stillness, a whisper caught in the grain of stone. The walls rise close on either side, etched with more than just names. Here, the hieroglyphs thicken, not crowded, but intentional. Like each carving carries more weight than the last. Your fingers hover just above the surface, not quite touching. You know better by now. These aren't just decorations, they're scripts, summons. A way to speak beyond the grave, but also a way to listen. This corridor isn't long, but it twists slightly, folding like a forearm drawn in against a chest. You round the bend and find yourself in a small, chamber less ornate than the others, but quieter in a way that makes your ears ring. At first, you think it's just acoustics, a trick of enclosed air. But then you realize it's not what you hear, it's what you don't. There's no wind here, no sand brushing the thresholds, no bird call bleeding in from above. It's as though sound itself has paused to pay attention. In the center of the room sits a statue, small, humble, kneeling, not standing, and on the soles of its stone feet is, delicately carved, oddly lifelike, as though the statue is trying to hear what the floor might say. You crouch beside it, careful, respectful. The air is cool here, touched by the slow breath of stone. You lean forward and examine the detail. Each ear finely etched, the curves and folds suggesting not just artistic talent, but anatomical reverence. Whoever carved this didn't rush. They knew exactly what they were doing. Mainstream fact: ancient Egyptian statues were designed with layered symbolic meaning. Some posed with arms across the chest to signify reverence. Others stood rigidly to represent eternal vigilance. But a statue with ears on its feet? That's different. That's not a pose, that's a message. You shift your gaze downward, to the floor beneath the statue. It's smoothed from centuries of visitors, of priests, of whispers dropped like seeds. This statue, unlike those perched high in temples, was designed to be low, grounded, receptive. It didn't gaze upon you. It waited for you to speak. Or, perhaps more accurately, it waited to listen. Here's the fringe bit. Some Egyptologists believe that these earfoot statues were placed in temple annexes specifically to receive prayers that weren't spoken aloud. The idea being sometimes words weren't shouted or sung, sometimes they were stepped, walked, breathed, left like footprints behind a quiet grief or a secret hope. And so, the statue listened through the ground. The logic is strangely beautiful. You walk into a sacred space. You don't shout your desires. You just walk. You pass. You carry your thoughts with you like invisible cargo. And the statue listens with its feet. You reach out now, not to touch, but to offer weight. Just your presence, just your silence. It feels appropriate. Historians still argue whether these statues served individual petitioners or whether they functioned as spiritual microphones for the whole temple. Some claim they were offerings themselves as symbols of eternal attentiveness, gifted by those who wished to remain present even in death. Others believe the ears represented the divine ability to hear from below, not just above. Either way, it turns the idea of listening on its head, or, more precisely, on its feet. You sit now, beside the statue. You're on the ground too, the same level. You realize what a strange act this is, to lower yourself to stone and whisper nothing. But somehow, it feels more potent than 1,000 shouted prayers. You imagine what others may have whispered here, not kings or generals or scribes, just ordinary people. A woman praying for her child to recover from fever. A man asking forgiveness for something he couldn't undo. A daughter hoping her mother would see her marriage from the afterlife. Not epic things, just real things. The kind that matter in quiet ways. Quirky tidbit. One archaeologist once wrote that he had found small figurines placed near statues, like this unmarked, unnamed, possibly carved by temple visitors themselves. Offerings, maybe. Or placeholders, as if people wanted to leave behind a version of themselves that could keep praying, even after they'd gone. You look again at the ears. They face inward, slightly, not dramatically, as if to say, I hear not the loudest cries, but the closest ones. There's something strangely comforting in that. You rest your palms flat against the ground. It's cool and smooth, like the pause before a song begins. You don't have to say anything. You're already heard. You linger for a long while beside the listening statue. There's no clock here, no ticking, no schedule, and certainly no need to rush. When you finally stand, you do so slowly, as though waking from a dream that hasn't quite ended. The echo of your silence still rests against the soles of your feet. Back in the corridor, the stone walls feel different, not colder, but more aware, as if they've overheard everything and chosen not to judge. The air is soft with dust now, the kind that floats without falling. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your breath. You move with it, deeper into the temple. Another chamber opens ahead, not large, but longer than the others, like a stretched-out breath. The ceiling here is low, pressed down as though the gods themselves leaned in to listen. And lining the walls more statues, dozens of them, each one different, some seated, some kneeling, some standing, but all with one thing in common, ears. Not just on their feet now, some have them on their shoulders, others on their hands. One statue, tucked into a far alcove, has an ear carved right at the base of its spine. You pause, fascinated. This is no accident. Mainstream fact: ancient Egyptian religion placed enormous importance on ritual communication. Temples weren't just places for the gods to be worshipped. They were imagined as literal houses places where the divine dwelled, received offerings, and, crucially, listened. Priests read daily from sacred texts. Incantations were recited at dawn. Scribes copied prayers onto thin strips of papyrus and left them in offering niches. And yet, some voices couldn't or wouldn't speak aloud. The quiet ones had to find another way. That's where these ears come in. Some scholars believe these ear-studded statues were created to hear different kinds of communication. The ones with ears on their shoulders might have symbolized bearing burdens. The ones with ears on their hands could represent hearing the unspoken sorrow you carried without saying a word. As for the one with an ear near its spine, a mystery. But maybe it meant listening to your past, or the ancestors that stood behind you. You walk slowly past each figure. It's like being in a room where everyone is listening, and you're the only one speaking, even if you say nothing. The statues hold their poses, dignified and patient. Each seems to tilt slightly, subtly, in your direction, or maybe that's your imagination. You reach one statue that seems older than the rest. Its face is worn smoothiless now, its nose long lost to time, but its feet are pristine. 2 large ears curve inward from the soles, crisply carved. You imagine the sculptor hunched over the stone, perfecting the shape, the folds, the subtle asymmetry that made it human. Quirky tidbit. In some Egyptian temples, visitors would bring pre-carved ear-shaped amulets and leave them behind as offerings. These weren't always attached to statues. Sometimes they would just pile dozens, even hundreds, like a basket of borrowed ears. Each one represented a prayer, a hope, a cry, a way of saying, "Please, someone hear me." You wonder what you'd leave here if you had to. Not something material, not gold or incense or bread, just a thought, maybe. A memory, something too heavy to carry, but too quiet to say aloud. Historians still argue whether these ear rooms were built for public use or reserved for high-status individuals who couldn't show vulnerability elsewhere. Some temples had hidden courtyards filled with these listening statues, no priests, no guards, just stone and silence. Others believe the practice varied wildly between regions and dynasties, each pharaoh putting their own spin on what it meant to be heard. But one thing is clear, the ancient Egyptians didn't just talk at their gods, they expected the gods to listen. And maybe that's what's most surprising, not the devotion, but the gentleness of it, the trust. To carve a statue not of power or wrath, but of patience, not of command, but of compassion. You find a bench-like slab near the wall and sit. The room is dim, lit only by a shaft of sun angled through a crack in the ceiling. Dust glitters in the beam, like sleep caught midair. You close your eyes. The statues are still, but the ears remain open. Listening. Always listening. The sun outside is likely high now, though inside the temple, time feels folded. Like the cloth of a well-worn robe, its creases are familiar, comforting, impossible to smooth out completely. You rise from the bench slowly. Your legs are stiff from stillness, your breath deep from silence. The statues watch you go, not with eyes, but with ears. Your steps take you toward another wing of the temple, this one older. You can tell by the floor uneven slabs, worn to soft dips by centuries of barefoot priests and wandering cats. The air shifts as you walk. It smells of old beeswax, crumbled incense, and something faintly metallic, like memory. You step into a low gallery. Light slants across the walls in thin sheets. Here, the ears change again. These aren't sculpted directly onto statues. They're reliefs, now carved panels, dozens of them, lined in neat rows. Left ear, right ear, full ear, just the lobe. No faces, no bodies, just ears. Each one is slightly different. Some are large and exaggerated. Others are tiny, discreet, almost modest. Many are labeled in faded hieroglyphs, names, titles, pleas. You don't need to read them to feel what they mean. This is a wall of requests, of prayers, of quiet declarations too fragile to be spoken in public. Mainstream fact. In later periods of Egyptian temple culture, worshippers would chisel images of ears directly onto sacred walls as a form of symbolic listening. These ears weren't meant to represent gods necessarily, but to embody the act of hearing itself. Some walls ended up with hundreds of ear carvings, a flood of silent voices reaching toward the divine. The idea was simple. If you left an ear, something might hear you. You move closer. The carvings are shallow, but precise. You run your fingers lightly over the stone, and never pressing, just tracing. There's a groove here, a curve there. Someone made this with care. Possibly thousands of years ago. You wonder what they were hoping for. Quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once discovered a wall with over 300 carved ears in a single chamber, all facing the same direction. At the base, buried beneath dust and rubble, they found a handful of tiny clay tablets. Most were cracked beyond reading, but one survived. Its inscription? A single line. "My daughter no longer sings." You stare at the wall. That line lodges somewhere inside your chest like dust in your lungs, like wind in your ribs. You want to ask who wrote it, what became of the daughter, whether the ears heard. But of course, there's no answer. Just stone, and the shape of hope. You continue walking. The gallery narrows slightly, bending like a crescent moon. At its center stands a freestanding altar, low and wide. Around its base, more ears. These are freestanding, this time-tiny sculptures of ears made from alabaster, basalt, and clay. Some are plain, others are painted. A few are cracked down the middle. Offerings are tucked between them. Petals, beads, a strip of faded linen. One tiny ear is wrapped in gold thread. This isn't for show. This was someone's sacred place. Historians still argue whether this kind of ear altar was standard practice, or something unique to specific cults or temples. Some scholars think these offerings were made during festival days, when the lines to speak to priests were too long and the gods too busy. Others believe this was the only way some people could pray if they had no voice, no coin, no standing. They left what they could, the symbol of listening. You sit again, this time on the stone edge of the altar. You can feel the temperature difference, the chill of stone pulled from the earth, the warmth of stone touched by hand. A breeze moves through the corridor behind you. It smells faintly of fire and myrrh. You imagine a procession here, centuries ago. Priests with shaved heads, children holding lotus petals. A woman whispering into a tiny stone ear before setting it down like a secret. You look down at your hands. Would you leave something too? And if you did, what would you ask? You think for a while. The silence lets you. A fly buzzes somewhere far off. Stone creaks under your weight. The sunbeam shifts, brightening the edge of a particularly elegant ear, carved in rose-colored granite. You don't touch it. You just sit beside it and listen. You continue along the lengthening path, past crumbling pylons and sun-bleached pillars. The Nile's presence hums somewhere behind you, a distant murmur of water and wind. But the statues remain ahead, rising from the earth like paused, thoughtsome, massive, others no taller than a goat, yet all of them carved with that unmistakable Egyptian intentionality. And more than a few, you notice, still have ears on their feet. Not just one statue, not an anomaly, a pattern. The further in you go, the more it becomes undeniable. At first, the repetition makes you wonder if it's symbolic. Well, of course it's symbolic, but symbolic of what? You crouch beside a small limestone figure, its body worn, but its feet oddly intact. There, again, the faint outline. A pair of carefully carved ears near the toes, delicately symmetrical, like little seashells pressed into flesh. It's unnerving and beautiful all at once. Mainstream fact: ancient Egyptian statuary was heavily coded. Every limb, posture, and material choice had purpose. Ears themselves were a recurring motif in Egyptian religion. Temples often had walls carved with ears, known as hearing walls, where commoners could whisper prayers or complaints to the gods. The idea was simple but profound. A god who can hear is a god who cares. So why place ears on feet? You trail your fingers over the carving. The texture is smoother than expected, worn by centuries of dust and prayer and sun. You glance at another statue nearby, this one larger, of a seated figure. Its feet, too, hold the same motif. Not just ears now, but small inscriptions beneath them. Petitions, names, single-word phrases like beloved, truth, return. Quirky tidbit. There's one theory that these feet, ears, weren't about listening upward, toward divine realms, but downward, toward the people. The ears on the feet were positioned to face the ground, possibly to hear the voices of those kneeling in front of the statue. An act of submission became an act of communication. The feet, not the face, were the point of contact between worshipper and deity. This changes how you see everything. You begin to notice the wear patterns differently, now smooth toes from where generations pressed their hands, whispered their secrets, left offerings. A statue wasn't just a representation. It was a living intermediary, a receiver, a witness. Historians still argue whether these foot ears were a priestly innovation, a regional flourish, or part of an older, pre-dynastic tradition that simply survived in specific cult centers. Some claim the style radiated from a single temple complex near Abydos. Others think it was more widespread, possibly a folk tradition formalized over time. Either way, you can't stop thinking about the implications. You picture a young scribe, desperate for justice, kneeling before the statue in the early light of morning. His words aren't loud. He's not proclaiming anything. He's whispering into the dirt, into the feet of a limestone god, into its ears. You imagine the ritual, offerings placed not at eye level, but near the base of the pedestal. Flowers, bits of bread, amulets wrapped in cloth. Maybe even a lock of hair or a torn piece of linen, a signature in silence. The priests might not always approve, but the gods might still listen. The deeper meaning begins to settle in your chest. This wasn't an afterthought. It was a design choice embedded with theology, a way to say, speak softly, and you will still be heard. You rise and step back, letting your gaze fall on the cluster of statues around you. So many ears, so many feet, and now you see a kind of choreography in their arrangement. A circle, a curve, like an amphitheater of stone listeners, facing different directions, but all with the same embedded message. We're not watching, we're listening. The air grows thicker, as if the very dust carries remnants of murmured hopes. You sit on a low bencher fragment of an ancient colonnade and feel the energy of the place shift. The statues are still, but they are not silent. They've been listening for centuries. You take a deep breath and close your eyes. The path forward isn't urgent. The questions can wait. For now, you simply sit. Not as a visitor, not as a researcher, but as one more voice among thousands wondering if your thoughts, too, might be heard through the soles of a stone god's feet. And the ears carved there remain open. The morning light begins to shift, bending over ruined columns and dappling the sand in warm golds. You rise slowly, brushing dust from your clothes, and walk again past statues and story stones, deeper into the temple's quieter reaches. The grandeur fades here. There are no colossal walls, no painted lintels, just space, quiet, and stone. You come upon a corridor barely shoulder wide, its walls leaning slightly, as though two sandstone giants are whispering over your head. The air cools, gently, like the breath of the building itself. On either side, tiny reliefs crawl across the surface cenote, the proud figures of gods and kings, but more modest carvings, commoners, servants, dancers, priests, all headed in one direction, toward a single raised platform at the end of the hall. You follow their lead. Mainstream fact. In some temple complexes, especially in Upper Egypt, there were petition chambers tucked deep inside the sanctuaries. These weren't meant for the grand rituals or public ceremonies. They were quiet rooms where supplicants could speak directly to the god not through a priest, but through the statue. You didn't need permission, you just needed devotion. And here at the end of this corridor is one such space, a small stone pedestal, once surely the base of a statue, now weathered smooth. No idol remains, but the platform itself has its own energy. You can see where knees have worn the front edge, where fingernails have nicked the sides, where wax from long burnt offerings still stains the corners. But what stops you is the floor. There, carved into the stone itself, are a pair of feet. Not sandals, not footprints. Feet, perfectly shaped, toes slightly curled, carved with careful attention. And, at the heels, yes, there they are again, ears. Two small, precise, unmistakable ears. Quirky tidbit. Some believe these feet, with ears, were meant not to represent a deity at all, but to serve as a proxy listener, like a divine voicemail box. If the main statue was inaccessible or ritually untouchable, you could still approach these carved feet, whisper into the ears, and feel that you had been heard. A holy workaround. You kneel beside them, uncertain whether to feel reverent or simply impressed. You find yourself leaning in slowly, awkwardly, and speaking. Not a prayer, not exactly, just a thought. I'm here. The acoustics of the chamber catch the words, not with an echo but with a hush, like the stone is folding the sound into itself. There is no thunderclap, no revelation, but there is stillness. And in that stillness, something close to comfort. Historians still argue whether these carved feet and ears were part of an older religious practice that predated the main cults of Egypt. Some link them to Nubian rituals, others to local, almost shamanic traditions that never made it into official theology but persisted through practice. The lack of inscriptions only deepens the mystery. No labels, no commands, just symbols, quietly waiting. You imagine the generations that knelt here. Farmers asking for rain, mothers hoping for safe births, elders wanting peace after loss, slaves begging for justice in whispers they couldn't speak aloud in the sunlit courtyards. All those voices gathered here like vapor. And now yours joins them. You remain kneeling, your hands resting gently on the stone. The carved feet feel warm, though you know that's just the sun's echo in the rock. The ears are smooth under your fingertips. Worn not by erosion but by contact. Touched thousands of times by people hoping someone or something was listening. You stay longer than expected. Not to pray, but to witness. This space is not famous. It's not in textbooks or tourist guides. But it holds something sacred all the same. A secret that was never meant to be hidden, just softly spoken. You stand slowly, letting your breath match the rhythm of the chamber. You continue walking not backward toward the temple's grand entrance, but forward, into an adjoining hall where fewer statues remain. Most are broken. Some are just fragments. A single hand, a section of knee, a chunk of pedestal, but one thing remains consistent. The ears, always at the feet, even when heads are gone, arms snapped off, inscriptions weathered to nothing, the ears remain. Some perfect, some chipped, but always positioned near the ground, always waiting. And suddenly, it's not eerie anymore. It's elegant, logical, beautiful, even. These gods were not seated above humanity, they were listening from below. Not watching from distant thrones, but standing among the people, feet to earth, ears to dust. You stop by one last fragment. A foot, alone, severed from its statue, propped, like a relic, on a low wall. You crouch beside it and smile. A child has recently pressed their small palm into the dirt and patted it against the stone. A single print, half smudged, rests just above the heel. No words, no offering, just contact. A reminder that even now centuries later, miles from meaning someone wanted to be heard. And maybe they were. The trail forward from the broken foot is less a path and more a suggestion. Time has brushed away the straight lines, and now everything feels softened corners of stone rubbed round by sand, walls melted into the earth, foundations swallowed up by wind and years. But you follow it anyway, drawn by a kind of resonance, like a song you heard once in a dream. You emerge into what was once an open-air court. The sun pours down between crumbled pillars, painting long shadows on the tiles beneath your feet. Here, the world feels split between silence and presence, like the gods are watching, but politely, respectfully. In the center, half toppled, lies a statue that must have once been immense. A kneeling form, arms missing, face obliterated by time or conquest or both, but the body still speaks. The curve of a spine, the tension of bent knees, and at the base, near what's left of the ankles there, they are again, ears. They seem to hum in the heat, not with sound, but with suggestion. You approach, crouch beside them, and wonder what this statue once heard, what secrets it kept. Mainstream fact: the ears, on feet motif isn't unique to one site. Archaeologists have found similar carvings from Memphis to Thebes, and even in Nubian border temples. But what's remarkable is how rarely they're labeled or explained. In a culture famous for its record-keeping and inscriptions, these little ears remain oddly silent. It's as if they speak a language not meant for hieroglyphs, but for humans. You run a finger across one ear's curve. It's deeper than the others you've seen, more defined. The sculptor cared about this detail. You imagine them at work, chisel in hand, sweat on brow, carving not an ornament, but a message. Speak here, we are listening. Quirky tidbit: some scholars speculate that the placement of ears on statues wasn't symbolic at all, but practical. That priests would whisper offerings, incantations, or even confessions into these carvings, believing the spirit of the god could enter through the feet, like plugging in a charger butt for the divine. Others laugh at the idea. It's just a motif, they argue. A flourish. Don't read too much into it. But that's the thing with symbols. You're supposed to read into them. That's how they work. That's what makes them stick around long after their makers are dust. You sit beside the statue, your legs crossed, your thoughts steady. Around you, the wind has slowed. The air feels thick with sun and story, and you realize the ears aren't about answers. They're about permission. You can speak here, so you do. You don't shout, you don't chant, you don't rehearse. You just say what's true. Maybe it's something mundane, how tired you are, how long it took to get here, how your shoes still carry temple dust. Or maybe it's something deeper, something about longing, or loss, or hope. Whatever it is, you say it softly, into the stone, and you imagine it traveling not up to heaven, but down into earth, folded between layers of limestone and time. Historians still argue whether these statues were ever meant to answer. Did people expect signs, dreams, visions, or was it enough just to speak, to know that something was paying attention? One Egyptologist once wrote, "The gods of Egypt were not remote, they were present. And to be present is to be available, to listen. You stay a while longer, no one comes. The courtyard is empty except for shadows and statues and the sound of your own breathing. And when you finally rise, it's not with sadness, it's with stillness. You begin the slow walk back, through corridors and arches, past figures half buried and doorways half gone. The ears appear again and again. At first, they startled you. Then they intrigued you. But now, they reassure you. Because now you understand, these were never decorations. They were declarations. We are here. We are listening. You reach the entrance of the temple just as the sky begins to shift. The first hints of dusk, a river not with drama, but with softness, like a hand laid gently on your shoulder. You look back one more time. The temple holds still. The statues remain where you left them, but the silence isn't empty anymore. It's full of voices, of footsteps, of whispered stories spoken into stone. You leave the temple and feel the wind wrap around you, not like farewell, but like acknowledgement. You carry the dust on your shoes, the image of carved ears in your mind, and something else in your chest, something shaped like gratitude. You were heard. That's enough.